Welcome back to the JumpifyLabs Podcast, the show for founders who want growth without the guesswork. Here we talk about the systems that drive predictable growth, and today's guest believes that the AI initiatives are failing not because of tech, but because leaders misunderstand the human brain. David Bovis has spent 4 decades inside manufacturing and enterprise, uncovering the neuroscience behind culture, engagement, and real productivity. David, welcome to the show.
Hi, Joe. Thanks so much for having me, mate. It's good to be here.
The pleasure's all mine. All right, David, let's kick things off. You spent 40 years in industry. What patterns keep repeating no matter the decade or no matter the technology?
Yeah, man and boy. Started in 1986, so 40 years this year. Well, yeah, I guess my background started plastic injection mold tool making. That led into production engineering. In that role, I got introduced to what was then called world-class manufacturing before it became lean. If anybody's familiar with those terms, Six Sigma, Agile, all that kind of stuff, operational excellence, and very much the same sort of toolkit, different banners over the years. And that's kind of answers your question. That's what I've seen repeating it when quality circles, total quality management, just in time, world-class manufacturing, lean, and then all the other bits and pieces bolted on, theory of constraints. And then we started to merge different disciplines and philosophies like lean and Six Sigma and called it Lean Six Sigma. Totally different things that people tried to force together. And throughout all of that, I saw that, in first-hand experience, VCs, consultants coming into companies, battling over what they believed good looked like with the people that had a different worldview, never considering that that was part of the problem, that these, there was completely different beliefs involved, and just forcing the tools and forcing the systems. So alongside the tools evolution over that last 40 years, that kind of missed the people piece, there was also the technology evolution. So you end up with MRP, MRP2, ERP, RPA, all these different iterations as technology improved and improved and improved, with the same promises that it was going to be the golden bullet. It was going to be, the solution to all ills in industry. And of course, all the time that foundational people piece is missing. None of it actually delivers what it promises. Sometimes it stalls, sometimes it fails catastrophically and costs tens, if not hundreds of millions for big corporates around the world when these projects go very wrong. And the same thing applies in mergers and acquisitions. You see, the value is in the talent that you buy in the organization, and then the cultures clash, the talent exits, and the value of the bought purchase drops. So we see these things, but the pattern is we keep trying to spend capex on projects and this project management mindset that, if we execute within a time frame, we'll get these results. All the time we do that, we alienate people, we increase defense mechanisms, we drive technology in which separates people. And coming back to your point about the neuroscience, brains need connection. They need human interaction. So we've created this situation from probably the 60s onwards when we started robotization, where productivity improvement rates have been stagnating and almost flatlined nowadays, whilst we're also reporting on disengagement, misalignment, resistance to change. There are all of these human issues that sit behind performance problems. So you get this, once you start seeing it at this end of 40 years, you see, well, if you keep just trying to do things to people, not with them, you keep putting more technology in that drives people apart so brains aren't getting the sensory stimulus they need from each other, and relationship quality deteriorates, which means culture deteriorates, then you just end up in this situation where businesses aren't performing as well as they could. And the world just seems to be blind to it in many respects because we haven't got this language to say what brains need. This is brain function, this is neuroscience. But that language is there, it's available. And if we introduce it, I'm seeing in my work around the world that it makes a phenomenal difference and starts to get that bit that's been missing for 40 years to shift in the right direction. And then all that output starts to fall into place, which is quite funny, really, because we've been basically just trying to approach change and transformation from the wrong end forever, it seems. When you put people first, profit follows. When you put profit first, people get damaged. And it's as simple as that.
Yeah, we had a really interesting conversation the first time we met and we discussed this. The technology is meant to give us, let's say, magnitudes of productivity. But when we introduce new technology, productivity stays about the same when the expectation is supposed to go this way. And it's because, as you mentioned, the brains from the people that are actually using the technology, the brains are not getting the things that the brain needs. Why don't we talk a little bit about what those things that the brain actually needs? Let's dive into the neuroscience a tiny bit.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, just to give you one example, there's so many aspects to it. I'll rattle a couple off. One is that we talk about stress, chronic stress in business, and everybody feels that they're under pressure, under stress, time constraints, capabilities, etc. And what we mean at a neurological level is that we've got artificially increased cortisol levels in our brain. And if cortisol is in our brain too much, then it starts to damage cells. It's meant to be a quick reaction and come back down again. And if it's there stimulated by our environment on a chronic basis, then it can decrease the substance in the brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's like, imagine you have to feed fertilizer on your tomato plants to get them to grow. But for neurons in the brain to change and adapt, which they're designed to do, you need BDNF, you need brain-derived neurotrophic factor. But cortisol kills it. So if we stress people out, we actually neurologically and biologically inhibit their capacity to change and adapt. And then we say, get this change program done in this time frame. So we've got these mechanisms that actually fight against our stated outcome objectives when we don't understand the neuroscience behind it. Another good example is that if you, and this is a guy called Robert Lustig, a medical doctor that speaks on this subject much more eloquently than I can, but fundamentally what he says is, and he's right, is that if you take the reward mechanism in the brain, so it's a dopaminergic system, it got tracks, sort of, they call it mesolimbic. It's over the top of the limbic system in the brain. And it's a series of neurons that need, that respond well to dopamine. So dopamine is associated to being a positive neurotransmitter. It's excitatory. It's got a positive charge through calcium and sodium ions and all that kind of stuff. And what it means is that if we get the signals from the world that gives us a sense of positive response reward, dopamine's there and it's exciting the next neuron. And so we feel happy, right? It's the same as any chemicals and drugs. It works in the same way. It's just that when we think of drugs, it's these drugs that do things in a massive way, whereas naturally occurring substances like dopamine affect the brain in manageable ways. So the problem is if we overstimulate that, and we can do that through sugars in food, which is where Dr. Lustig comes from, or we can do that through getting the next ping, the next like, the next notification on an app. That's a short-term reward mechanism. And that artificially raises dopamine. So a little bit more into the science, right? You've got a neuron, which is a cell body with some branches on top and a long tail called an axon. If you've got too much dopamine coming from this cell, which is the end of the axon this way, and it's jumping that synaptic gap, as it's known, that gap between neurons that chemicals have to bridge to communicate. If there's too much dopamine, this cell can't take it because it becomes damaging. So it starts to shut down its uptake receptors, right? So I'm shutting the branches down, but the general principle. And so what that means is you now can't get the same amount of stimulus from that dopamine hit, from that activity that you got the first time around. So good example is like when you get addicted to anything, and because it's that short-term reward, it's like shopping online or eating chocolate, all right? So you shopaholic, chocoholic, this is the definition of addiction. You get too much dopamine, you get used to it, you want more. And so, you'll appreciate this, Jay. I know you're a fit-looking guy, right? So you probably look after your diet, but you probably like chocolate the same as I do. You have the first bit, and if you haven't had any for a week, it's just heaven, right? It's just that beautiful response. That's your dopamine. So you want another bit. You have another bit, and it's not quite as nice as the first bit. That's because your taste buds on your tongue and everything are linked to this dopamine response. And it's not because it's not triggering the same amount of dopamine so you don't get the same gratification. It's because the first set of stimulus from the first bit of chocolate has already started shutting down the uptake receptors. If you therefore can't get the same reward from the same stimulus, so you eat the next bit of chocolate and end up eating the whole bar and still never taste quite as good as the first bit, that becomes stressful because the brain's saying, I'm repeating this behavior, but I'm not getting the same reward. So then the cortisol levels go up. And when you get elevated cortisol and dopamine levels, it starts to have a negative impact on serotonin. And serotonin is an inhibitory or neutral. It goes both ways and you get really technical about it. But think of it as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's got a negative charge that downregulates the next cell. What that means is, and it features in the prefrontal cortex a lot, what it means is if we have got the tendency to think things through in language, which is neurons firing, and we haven't got that serotonin level to put the brakes on, then we overthink things and we call that being anxious, right? And if it gets too extreme, we call it being depressed. So if we've got technology, we've got stress, we've got sugar in our foods, we've got all these things that we create in the environment, it has this impact at a chemical level on the brain that ultimately damages the one chemical in the brain we need for self-regulation and long-term happiness, right? Because that's linked to long-term happiness, purpose is all linked to serotonin activity as well. So we're in this situation where we're creating a world in ignorance of neuroscience, if that's not too strong a word to use, so that we're doing these things to ourselves that we're not aware of. And then we're reporting increased depression in teenagers, increased suicide rates, increased health issues that are linked to cell inflammation and ATP production through mitochondria, diabetes too. All these different conditions in the world that are these medical conditions can be traced back to brain hormone, neurotransmitter type imbalances. And we can see that the triggers for those comes from the way we run businesses, the way we lead, the stress we put on people, the technology we ask people to engage with, the amount of gratification they're getting from notifications and all that kind of stuff. So it starts to become this big picture when you get into the detail. And I've seen that all through my life, even when I was a tool maker. If you didn't get the first bit of metal squared up and blocked up properly, building the rest of the mold tool became a problem. So it's about sweating the small stuff to understand the big picture and being able to bring that together, because without one part of it or the other, we make mistakes. And I think without being too harsh or serious or condemning other people, because we didn't have this knowledge up until now, we have got it now. So it's a beautiful place to be in the world, but we can actually tap into this stuff and start using it to our benefit. And so that's not to criticize anybody of the past, but we've just not had it available. And so we've been making these kind of mistakes, and we don't have to anymore, which is a great place to be as the human race. You know, the technology we have developed gives us this power, this new language, this capacity to make these big system connections and go, why are we doing this to ourselves? You know, just in pursuit of profit normally is the issue. Yeah, that's it, mate. Really, a couple of examples of some of the neuroscience and how it links into being practical.
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating topic for me. So I'm gobbling it all up and I'm just like, ah, man, what am I doing to my brain? What am I doing to the brain of the people around me? But your leadership teams are asking you to come in to increase productivity. And then you have to educate them first on what's actually happening behind the scenes within the brains of the people that are on the teams themselves. But how do they react when they first start to understand the actual brain chemistry that's going on behind the scenes?
But it's been an interesting journey. I'll give you a bit more context just before I answer that. I've been talking about this for 25 years, I'm 26 now probably, openly on LinkedIn. And to begin with, I got a lot of people saying, shut up, Bovis, what's neuroscience got to do with leadership or culture or change? And my response has always been, well, everything. You know, if you employ people and they've got a brain, then it applies, right? Because we haven't got the capacity to do anything, speak, think, make a decision, act on anything, unless our brain has functioned before we become consciously aware of it. So what I've seen since COVID is a massive shift in the market. Not only have we had 10 or 15 years by that point of neuroscience being reported more in the news on an increasing basis, we've also had this massive shock that says if something strong enough threat comes along, people can adapt within a week or two and start working from home and work from home successfully for years and keep businesses running. So it made people rethink the idea of the human element in their people, process, systems, you know, organization, whatever you want to call it. So that really changed thinking. And I've found that I've had a business teaching this stuff since that massive shock to the world, which is very interesting in its own right from a sort of social science point of view. But how people react. So the reason people come to us and select us in the first place is it's only the people that have been trying to lead change, usually in multi-site corporates, for decades, and are frustrated that either their change programs stall or stagnate or fall over once they leave, or there's no sustainability. It's always been a big contentious issue around change programs. Project management doesn't solve the problem because that's even more logic-based execute type mindset. And there's been something missing, and people that have been in the arena for long enough sense that, but they can't verbalize it, they can't identify it. So when we come along and say, look, explain, this is the people bit, this is what it looks like, and this is why we've been making these kind of mistakes forever. The forward-thinking companies that we're working with are going, right, that sounds like what we've been looking for and have not been able to put our finger on. And those are the kind of companies we're working with, which is fantastic for us. To answer your question directly now, given that context, when they come through the course, first of all, and this is the mistake we make in business so often, we will ideally visit site, meet the teams that are being recommended to go through it, or that the senior leaders that have engaged with our ideas are thinking about, and we'll give them a couple of hours opportunity to understand what it is, build some trust, think that we're okay kind of people to work with, get that neural response in the right place to begin with. And if anybody's got any reservations, any hesitation, I'll say, well, don't bother coming then, because there's no point. You can't coerce a human brain into change. Somebody's got to have enough curiosity to want to have a psychological towards response. If there's any kind of defensive away from response, which is what we trigger in people all the time, the way we run businesses, then you're not going to get the outcome objectives that you're aiming for. Because as soon as that glucose energy is diverted to defense and protection and away from, it's not being used to do neural adaptation. So they don't learn. They just reinforce their existing beliefs about why what you're saying is wrong. So if you don't get the engagement to begin with, you've lost the battle from the start. So that's the most important step. Once we get people going, actually, no, this sounds quite interesting. I'd be interested to learn more about this. Then we go, okay, well, come along. It's a 5-week course, et cetera. And we put them on it. And typically what we see is that by week 3, people are going, oh my God, this is about me. This is how I regulate my emotional response so that I don't trigger the negative emotional response in the other person. And by the end of the course, we see relationships improve in senior leadership teams, in management teams and supervisory level teams on shop floors. We see vertical and horizontal communication get better, which means we support the better execution of strategy, tactical moves department by department. We get rid of conflicting KPIs because people start openly saying this part of the business is fighting against this part of the business. And now we're in a position to openly talk about it and do something about it. So it brings out a whole different level of conversation because, to make it simple, if you're in a project management, change management environment and you're taught how to be a leader by the standard that's been in the market for decades, normally you'd go along the lines of, hey guys, this is what we've got to achieve, double-digit EBITDA, whatever it might be in year. So this means we've got to do X, Y, Z better, usually quality cost delivery type improvement programs to manufacturing efficiencies. And that means, we've got to execute this task and that task and bring this new machine in and change that process and blah, blah, blah. So make it so, go and do it. And then we put those plans together and then we take it to the teams that are actually going to be involved and we say, this is what we planned. What do you think? And of course, they're then under social pressure to go, yeah, no, that sounds great. Let's do that. But they don't mean it. They don't believe in it. There's no emotional connection to it. They just know what they're actually thinking is, great, here the bosses come with more work again. Right. So now I've got to do my 8-hour day, which I'm already taking 120% to get done. So I'm having to do overtime. And now they want me to do this change stuff as well. So that's the response we trigger. And then what happens when you've got BTFA language, this language that we use around neuroscience, and people understand how humans function and respond rather than just what's logical, but the emotional response, they change the language. They say, hey guys, if we had to achieve this, how do you think we could get there? And then they come up with their own ideas, which engages the brains. They start thinking about it rather than having control imposed upon them. And then the next question is, yeah, but how do you feel about that? And, and then what you usually see to begin with until people get used to it and practice it is, well, what I think is if we do this, this and this, and because they're conditioned to respond like that, we say, no, we didn't ask you what you think. We asked you how you feel. And they go, what do you mean? I say, well, what is it? How do you feel? What's your gut telling you about whether this is a good direction or not? And eventually you can tease it out of them and they go, oh, well, no, actually, it really makes me uncomfortable because, we can't get that kind of grinding wheel anymore into machine aluminium. We would need that so it doesn't block up. Or, the technical knowledge they've got, they can bring to the party starts to then come out. And then you realize what you can and can't do strategically and tactically in the business because you hear those people because you value what their brains can bring to the party. And then they feel seen and heard and valued. And that's when you start getting culture change because it shifts the dynamic from plans and execution to feelings being valued, positive emotional response, which means chemicals change in the brain, innovation goes up, collaboration goes up, teamwork goes up. And this is the root cause of high performance cultures that we've been missing forever. We didn't understand it when we tried to copy Toyota techniques, because it came from a Japanese culture, which didn't translate very easily. Now neuroscience gives everybody in the West the language we need to really understand what's going on. And rather than doing it from a cultural, intuitive point of view, putting some science behind it and going, well, look, this is 1 and equals 2 and 2 and 2 equals 4 as far as the brain is concerned. So if you want to get a good outcome, you've got to do this for your people. And when leaders understand that, then they lead change and projects much more effectively.
I mean, this is such a interesting, fascinating conversation. I talked to many leaders out. What you're saying is absolutely what they're seeing as well. Some of the things they coach their clients and organizations through. How do you include the people so that they buy into the mission, they feel included, so that the people ultimately are able to provide their expertise and all the gifts that they bring to the table? Because otherwise, it's just locked away in the treasure chest, and no one's really getting the benefit from it. You're breaking it down in a way that's based on science and on the one of the most fascinating organs that I'm super glued to is which is our brains. But you're breaking it down in such a cool, interesting way. And that it's so important because we all have brains. And the things that we learn with the workspace can translate in our personal lives when we're not at work. This whole thing is just super fascinating. But I also do want to talk about, which we are having a conversation about technology. Why is AI adoption failing inside many organizations? Is it all because as well, because we're not taking care of and prioritizing the neuroscience behind it?
Yeah, pretty much the answer is yes. Very simply, it's the same pattern. The technology is advanced, and obviously, I think ChatGPT is fantastic, right? It does some things that I could never have believed in my lifetime up till now were possible by sitting in front of a computer. You know, you can get pretty well structured advice on most things, and in some respects, that's great. But there's so much fear around it as well, and the brain's a prediction machine fundamentally. And what we're saying, you know, if we're talking together, Jay, you know what word I'm going to say, and you probably said next in your head, right? Because your brain's predicting so quickly all the time in milliseconds about am I safe or not? And it's been something that's really came out around some studies into emotional prediction as well by Lisa Feldman Barrett. It's really interesting studies, but it really highlights the fact that we're not functioning the way we think we function. Right. Once you start looking at what it means to be human through this neuroscience lens, it becomes very obvious that the brain is so quick at what it does. It is processing the world at about 2 million bits of data per second. We only become conscious of about 56 bits of data per second, a few 100 milliseconds after it's already been dealt with. So, what the brain does to keep us safe, which is its only job, right? There's a very simple phrase that I've boiled everything down to for myself, which is survive efficiently, right? Because there's a glucose energy consumption aspect to it because of glucose being converted from carbohydrates and stuff. The brain wants to keep us alive, but it wants to do it in an efficient manner because it's a really energy intensive organ, right? It uses 20% of all the energy we produce. And I think a lot of people have heard that statistic now. So it's got to try and take shortcuts, which is why we call them biases and making assumptions and jumping to conclusions. But really what that means is the brain's had all this experience of life and it's been imprinted with these hundreds of trillions of synaptic connections that represent our experience up to date. And it uses that network to go, can I tell what's coming next? Can I be safe if what I expect happens? Yes or no, right? And it's linked to algorithms called hierarchical temporal memory and stuff like that. A company in Silicon Valley called Numenta discovered years ago. So you've got this capacity for your brain to be going, can I assess the world for what I'm getting in terms of inbound sensory stimulus? Can I process that and predict whether I'm going to be safe or not? And what we respond to is that prediction and prediction error. So if we can predict something and it happens, so we carry on talking like this and you hear what you expect to hear from me, your brain doesn't get any kind of shock, right? If I suddenly said pink elephants, which is that whole that memory game trick thing works, all of a sudden that's completely so out of context of what we're talking about. Your brain starts to process pink elephants. Is there a risk from this? Why is he talking about pink elephants, right? So that's what the brain does all the time. And it can be in terms of people's facial micro expressions, body language, sounds, noises, shadows, all sorts of things coming from the environment. So we're always predicting ahead to say, are we safe? And that happens not only in milliseconds, but in whole seconds, in minutes, in hours, days, years, months, whatever, months, years. So when it comes to job security, can we pay the mortgage? Are our kids going to be safe? Our future generation is going to be safe? How is work as we know it going to continue to be the way it is? And then people come along with AI and say, we don't need you. This is going to be fantastic. Look how much more money we can make because we can get rid of the headcount. Of course, people are going to interpret that as a threat, right? So there's this psychological response of defense, distancing oneself, blame, projection, all these coping mechanisms and defense strategies that the brain starts to run in the background unconsciously to say, what threat is this to me? because fundamentally our brain's only responsible for keeping us alive, nobody else. So that whole saying, with them, the WRRFM, man, best radio station everybody tunes into, which means what's in it for me, right? It's a great little acronym that really sums up the way our brain works, which is to keep us safe. And that's really what's driving all of us. We're inherently, I wouldn't say selfish, but we're inherently geared to make sure we survive. And if anything comes along, even new technologies that threaten what our brain's already got mapped, it has to be treated to a threat until it can be proven to be beneficial. So it's obvious that we're going to respond to the developments in the world right now on a technological basis, the way the brain's designed to respond, because that's just what being human is. So until we get past those human barriers, and it's the same with lean change programs, new projects, new equipment coming in, redundancy programs, whatever it might look like in business, the human brain's designed to respond that way. Everything's guilty until proven innocent, because that's the way we stay alive best. So if we want AI adoption, the same as if we wanted RPA adoption and ERP adoption and MRP adoption, it's still another technological change to what people have got mapped in the world. And they're still going to have a normal human response, which is defensiveness. So until we start dealing with the human responses, we haven't even got the first clue on how to address that before we introduce the stuff that's going to cause the negative response. So we get stuck in these loops over and over again, which goes back to your first question and what I first said about the same patterns repeating over 40 years. We haven't, I'll go back to my earlier point, we haven't had the language, we haven't had the scientific knowledge to explain this up until recently. In the last 10 years or so, that knowledge has expanded exponentially across the planet. The problem is now people see the idea of learning about neuroscience just as threatening as they see the idea of AI, because they're still going, what's neuroscience got to do with brain function, or manufacturing or industry or leadership or culture or anything? So they've still got that same neural pattern rejecting the thing that can actually help them get past the barriers. So that's a bit frustrating for me, as you can imagine. But like I said, the forward-thinking companies are working with us, so that's good. We're getting somewhere.
Yeah, interesting how you say that, how it's almost acting like one of these installs, like a new system install, new productivity hack, whatever installation, and it's still getting the same resistance. That's
just the word neuroscience can alienate people, right? The same way as mindfulness can sound soft and fluffy and be dismissed as tree huggy, and our brain responds to every word we use. So the fact that it's called neuroscience, and that's not a word that's normal in the manufacturing production rhetoric, immediately the brain treats it as a threat until proven that it's safe. So it's a barrier we all have to overcome. Hence, again, going back to what I said earlier, if we're going to engage with anybody, the first thing to do is go and trigger a higher oxytocin release in their brain, which we call building trust, right? And trust comes from knowledge and credibility and whether you can identify with somebody. So when I go and see senior leaders, I talk about my time in consulting when I was doing operational due diligence for buy-side transactions and EBITDA and return on capital employed and balance sheets. If I go to the shop floor, I talk about my time as a tool maker and when I used to run factories. So if you can get the language that the other brain has mapped so that you can identify with people, you trigger oxytocin release. That's critical to everything that comes after it, whether that brain's going to frame what it sees next as positive or negative. And like I say, if you don't get that bit right up front, then you don't get anywhere. So if I go and say to people, hey, you're a leader, you need to know more about neuroscience because dopaminergic mesolimbic pathway type responses cause excess cortisol and it damages serotonin, they're going to go, what's this weirdo on about? If you can turn around and try and make sense of it, which is why we simplified the model down to BTFA, believe, think, feel, act. It's a language register people can engage with, even if they've never heard anything about neuroscience. People have got beliefs, they think, everybody thinks, everybody has emotions. And, you can see that quite often, depending on someone's emotional states, how they react and act to something. That's a starting point. That's a door. That's an entry point. Once they then learn what that means in more technical detail, that's the start of the journey. And that's when you start framing the way you interpret the world differently. You can ask different and better questions of why are we having these problems in this business? And a lot of it, despite some of the old sayings from certain famous people about 99% of the problems don't talk back and things like that, because it's always process and systems. That's true. But brains design the process and systems, right? So if those brains believe in imposed control, because you've got to stick to standards, because you've got to execute to quality levels, then there's this whole dynamic that you're never going to challenge. As soon as you understand it from a neuroscience point of view, you go, okay, what assumptions were we making about the human element when we were setting those standards and designing those systems? And what are those systems doing to the brains to make them respond the way they are? Why haven't we still got quality improvement or cost control in our situation? Because the guys are still pretty much railing against all the training we've just invested in for the last 4 years. These are the kind of things that you can start then exploring. If you haven't got the language for it, you can't even entertain those questions.
So step one is triggering the oxytocin response by showing them that you speak their language and that you're someone that they can trust.
Yeah, it comes from genuine, authentic. I've been where you've been, guys. I feel your pain. And not because you're trying to sell to them, because you care for them and you're there to help. You know, if you've got any other ulterior motive, we're so clever because of that 2 million bits of data per second scanning. Everybody picks up on it. If you're not authentically there to genuinely contribute positive outcomes to people, people will see through you in a second. So you can't have ulterior motives. You can't have nefarious intent. It just gets picked up like that because their brains are designed to do that. So, yeah, and so I'm not playing games doing that. I'm just aware of the mechanism that's at play. And I'm hoping I can help people the most I can by doing the best job of helping them realize that we're credible and this will make a difference to their lives. If they don't want it, that's fine as well, because you can't, horse to water can't make it think kind of thing, but you've got to be authentic and genuine. If you don't actually care about people and you're there to make money, it's just you've lost from the beginning, really. And that's obviously what the whole of the capitalist world is geared towards, is how do I get humans to execute tasks to produce things that make money? And I think it's that whole philosophical position that we can challenge through this lens of neuroscience as well. And if we can shift that belief about what works and what doesn't work, what good looks like when it comes to what do we put first, what do we prioritize, then we start to really see some fantastic change in the right directions.
How long does that change actually take? Like the implementation? Because I mean, I'm sure the answer is it depends on the size of the organization, but there are, this brain-friendly processes need to be implemented at so many different levels. But how long does a transformation typically happen? How long does it usually take for it to go from start to becoming a brain-friendly organization?
Yeah, and I guess, come on based on some of the case studies, I think we saw quite a rapid transformation because of the amount of investment was put into key people in key places at GK and Aerospace, for example. And they reported £410 million ROI on their purchase investment, from the Melrose brothers within 4 years, which was pretty phenomenal because it was sort of upregulated. JP Morgan Casanova reported in the Times they've had to increase the ROI prediction in May, and then they increased it again in November before they reported results, kind of thing, in year 4. So, and that was because Philip Holt, who's the author of 3 great books on lean and transformation, and he was the VP of Global Transformation. Don't shoot me, Philip, if you see this and I got your title wrong, mate. He engaged with BTFA, this process, and he trained, I think it was 52 people globally that were in key transformation project responsibility in different regional areas around the world. And as a result, they got those kind of results. And it's not a direct link. You can't say BTFA delivered £410 million, but in his 3rd book, I think, Philip does say he gave me a statement that he's happy with, which was a lot of the success can largely be attributed to the way we approach the change because of what we learned through BTFA. So it's not like most accountants want it. You do this, you do that, you lever this, you press that button, and this is the result. It's much more, if you treat people right, they're going to be able to be in a better place mentally. So that was sort of over that 4-year period. What we've seen with other clients is that within 18 months, I think, if you get the senior leadership team going on this first, which is ideal, sometimes we come in mid-level and move up. But ideally, we start at the top. They see the shift. Because if you come in mid-level, the mid-level people very quickly get frustrated that their bosses aren't seeing the world through the same lens, because it changes the way you see everything. And so you come in at the top and the leaders understand the benefit. Then they say, okay, we need our reports in our different departments to understand this stuff too. Then they start speaking this different language and having different conversations. And then that starts to filter down and we start to get, unsolicited reports back from shop floor level that what's happened to the leadership team? This feels nicer. No, we're being valued more, we're being heard more, we've got a voice. And then they start contributing more and then coming up with better ideas about improvements and all that stuff we've been looking for from a CI, continuous improvement point of view, for decades. So that typically, it depends how quickly really you reach that tipping point. I think the statistics, I've got a document on it somewhere that says get to about 33%, a third of your leadership team starting to adopt a new approach, then that's when it starts to self-replicate and be adopted by others. Once you get past 50%, it's almost a given that that's going to be your new culture, your new approach to the way you work. So if we can get to, and to train 30 to 50% of a team within an organization, and that just, like I say, depending on the scale and size, how quick we can roll that out for people without disrupting production and whatever else. But yeah, I mean, typically a sensible, mid-size 70 to 100 million turnover, sort of large SME kind of just under mid-market type levels, you're probably talking, you could do it within a year if you put people through quickly, before that really starts to become embedded. We always give a little bit of post delivery support as well, and go and facilitate workshops and run sessions to encourage that BTFA lens being applied to real life problems and that kind of stuff. But it doesn't have to take long at all. It basically, it's regulated by how many people you want to put through the program as quickly as you can afford to in time and money, basically. The faster you do it, the quicker you'll get to results.
Okay, wow. I was really looking forward to this conversation, and it didn't disappoint whatsoever. It just feeds my hungry brain, the brain that's hungry for knowledge and just wanting to get better. I'm interested in implementing a lot of these things that you've discussed already. I know that this so many layers deep, but where can people go to learn a little bit more about the kind of work you're doing at Ducks in a Row?
Well, there's the website. You can see how it's spelled, ducksinarrow.com. So that's pretty easy to find. Ducks is Latin for leader. So it's not just mummy duck and baby ducks kind of alignment. There's another layer of for the name as well, just if anybody's wondering why we called the company Ducks in a Row with a funny spelling. So that's that. But I mean, I think probably where I'm most prolific is, I've just been appointed as an executive contributor to Brains magazine, so you can find my profile there, which is nice to have that kind of third party validation from a big magazine like that. But also my LinkedIn profile, find me David Bovis on LinkedIn. I think the URL is LinkedIn/Ducks in a Row, and you'll find me. And I do a couple of newsletters. I do a weekly one, a monthly one. The weekly one's called Neurophilosophy for thinkers, and that's trying to just put the neuroscience onto the ancient philosophy and bring the two things together to show why some deep thinkers of the past were right about what they were speculating about. So there's a few ways to find me. Obviously there's a Facebook page and an Instagram thing. I don't do so well on those, but we tried to cover the bases on social media and then realized it's difficult to keep up. So I try and focus on the website and on LinkedIn more than anywhere else.
Absolutely. All right. So if this conversation was interesting for you listeners, make sure you check out Ducks in a Row. That's DUXINAROE. So the spelling is a little bit funky, but you'll find a lot of the David's information there. And he's also very active on LinkedIn, where we first connected. If you like more stories like this, you want to hear from other leaders pushing the envelope for growth, be sure to tune in to Jumpify Labs for more. My name is Jay. Thanks so much. See you next time.